Today's episode of The Jai Dave Show is brought to you by the Life Force Academy. Life Force Academy, beautiful way to have a great home yoga practice, meditation practice. Whether you're brand new or a seasoned practitioner, it'll meet you right where you're at. Keep your body healthy, keep your mind healthy, relaxed, connected to your deeper sense of purpose. So important in these times, especially. Keep your immune system strong, nervous system strong, endocrine system balanced, all the good things. If you go over to lifeforce.yoga, just type that into your browser, lifeforce.yoga, you can begin a 14-day trial into the Life Force Academy for just $1. Today's episode of the podcast is also brought to you by the new Simrit single, Some May Say. You have to check this beautiful music out. Some May Say, wherever you get your music, Spotify, Apple Music, Simrit, S-I-M-R-I-T. While you're at it, check out all the good Simrit music over there. But at the end of this episode, really want you to hear this. We will play the whole entire single of the Simrit Some May Say that just came out a couple weeks ago. And then head over to your Spotify or Apple Music, wherever you get your music, and stream and download. Some May Say, download the Simrit Live in Los Angeles, came out earlier this year. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast, everyone. If you haven't already subscribed, please do so. If you love what you're hearing, please leave us a rating or a review. Would really appreciate that. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the episode.
Looking kinda right, but I'm a usual type. Low on the choppy side, but in boogie been tight. So when she said maybe I can be just tonight, all I could say was alright. But that woman put a root on me. Lord God, she put a root on me.
I think Gullah Geechee language and culture still existing today, wholly and intact. Like the fact that the language of enslaved people is still here, having survived generations of a ban on literacy, is one of the great miracles and achievements, of American society, period.
That's my friend Sunn Masho, who is the special guest on the podcast today. And I'm real excited for you all to meet him, to learn from him, to hear about his story and the story of his people, the Gullah Geechee people. Is real fascinating and very important, especially right now. I think this is going to be something you'll find really inspiring and illuminating. I met Sunn about 20 years ago or so when I lived in Charleston, South Carolina. We were all poets, and that's how we connected, and that's how I know Sunn. There was a great place at the time in downtown Charleston on King Street called Sir Metz, and each week there used to be a poetry night, and it was a real scene, and it was an inspiring scene, and there was a lot of really talented people there, and in the first 10 to 15 minutes or so of this episode, we're reminiscing a little bit about all of that, talking about it, and talking about how that period of time was very influential in all of our lives, and so anyhow, Sunn was always stood out as just number one, a phenomenal poet, a great performer, exceptional wordsmith, and he could just make you think or lift you up or change your consciousness just in how he would not only write his poetry but how he would deliver it. He had that skill. And Sunn now, he's an activist. He is artist. He's an excellent musician. And of course, as I mentioned, he's now a teacher at Harvard University and teaching the Gullah Geechee language, which you'll hear all about in this episode. And so actually, until today, I hadn't had a conversation with Sunn since I had moved away from Charleston many, many years ago. We've, kept in touch in the sense and been aware of each of our trajectories via social media over the last many years, but we hadn't really had a conversation, and I really enjoyed it. He's a real inspiring brother, talented as can be, and I just enjoyed this conversation a lot. And we cover a lot of things. We cover some of his life. We cover the Gullah Geechee people and the language, but we also we're just in conversation, the Black Lives Matter movement, the powerful evolution that is happening on our planet, and particularly in the United States right now, and everything that goes along with that. It was real enjoyable. I want you to definitely check out his social media. He's a great follow on Instagram, Twitter. His handle is Sunn and I. We'll have that in the podcast notes here, and you can just click on it. But if you want to know how it's spelled, it's SUNNMCHEAUX. Again, his handle on Twitter and Instagram, SUNNMCHEAUX, Sunn Masho. Or you can also go to his website, sunnmasho.com. All that'll be in the show notes. But yeah, this was great. I'm real happy for everyone to hear it and to meet Sunn. And thanks so much for listening, everyone. Enjoy the episode. All right, Sunn.
Mm-hmm.
Appreciate you doing this with me, brother.
Absolutely. I appreciate the invitation.
It's good to see you. I think it's probably been about close to 20 years since
it's been a lifetime, like literally. It's been a minute.
I've kept up with you a little bit on social media, but we haven't had a conversation in a long time. So I'm actually very interested in what's happened in your life, but even stuff I didn't know prior to we knew each other in Charleston. Where are you, by the way, right now?
Right now, I'm up in Boston. I'm, of course, with COVID, I haven't really done much traveling as of late back home to Charleston. Well, actually, I haven't done any traveling back home to Charleston. So yeah, I'm kind of marooned here in Boston for the time being.
Cool. I'm excited to get into that and hear about how that all happened and how you ended up there in Boston and Harvard. But just to set a little context, we knew each other in, I guess, kind of early 2000s, I believe.
Yeah. It was as I was actually just talking about that era with Charlton Singleton from now he's in Ranky Tanky. At the time, it was a Gradual Lean, another absolutely awesome band. And that was like a really like a Renaissance sort of space for Charleston when it came to the poetry, spoken word, which is the set that we met on, and so diverse. And I know people toss around the word diversity now, and it's kind of taken on a different meaning, in my opinion, that doesn't embody the true spirit of diversity, which is people doing it on their own, not having an outside force mandating who's supposed to do what. Like this was organic.
Yes.
And I think that added to it. You had, at Sumet's, which is now no longer there, you would have people who were, because of the racial demographic of Charleston, you would have a wealth of Black people downtown.
Yep.
Which is not always often the case in many downtown areas in certain spaces, depending on the population where you are. We just happen to have a city that has a little over 50% Black people. So you would also have, obviously, the white people who were there. Then, because it's a military town, you would have people from different ethnicities and different backgrounds who've come there. And then because it's a high tourist area, you would have tourists who were there as well. It was just such a melange of people coming together in this kind of Blind Tiger-ish sort of restaurant / after hours, like environment. And I just remembered feeling like, how you sometimes you can feel like you're a part of something. And I remember saying this back then. that there's going to come a time in the future when the people who were there will look back to that moment, and the people who are there and pouring, I think it was like a night where it was particularly noisy. Like some of the crowd was, not really as, paying as much of attention to the crowd as a performance as they probably could have. And I'm the chastise the audience type of performer. So I stood up on the table and did my poem on the top of the table, and then just started freestyling this part about, how they're going to look back on this, and the people who've gone on to greatness, they'll be able to say, I was there that night and I saw this person or that person doing that thing. But you don't have to wait until later. You could say that now. You could, what I'm saying? Like, you don't have to do it for clout later. You can do it out of appreciation now. And that's how it felt. It felt, you could sense that something is here. Like in just one lineup, you would have poets who got up and did like this rapid fire sort of hip hop styled poetry with a backbeat of like this really earthy, aggressive, yet smooth jazz backdrop. Harold, he was like he'd walk around with like incense and like, he'd like sage the room.
And he was an organizer too, wasn't he?
Right.
He brought us to, I think we went up to Charlotte one time.
Yeah. It was either Charlotte, Raleigh. I think it was Charlotte. It might have been Charlotte. That was dope.
Yeah.
Like that was, if you think about that selection of talent and people who were there, and it caused you, like I was already into a lot of the stuff that other artists were into. And I remember one of our last in-person conversations years ago, I was trying to jog your memory about this poem that you did that just just like blew my mind. And you were looking like, it sounds familiar, maybe, I'm not sure. And in my mind, I remember thinking like, how blessed are we that you could have something that dope and not even recall what it is, like what it was. You have so much dope content that you're like, yeah, I'm not sure about that one. Like, it sounds familiar, but it could have been any one of the things that I did. And, George O. Fish, my boy who was, always loved having like that 1-2 punch there. It was just different. Some people would get up and read a poem out of their book. And it would just be this very unassuming sort of, poetry. And then other, sometimes it was sing-songy or whatever. And what I liked about that was that it wasn't just artistic performances, but it actually was doing two things at once. It was actually reflecting the culture and also pushing the culture forward at the same time. It was this synergetic, sort of thing where it was doing both at the same time and creating motion. And I could name a list of the people who were performing then, like what they're doing now.
Yeah, right.
Like, not that outside success in that regard or material success gives it meaning or validates it. But there is something reaffirming about the fact that people who were not heard pressed on until they were.
Yes.
You see what I'm saying? And so that's something that just let me know, like, keep doing what you're doing, because even if in that moment it's not fully appreciated or fully recognized, rather. I don't know if appreciate is the word. I think they appreciated it, but I'm not saying, I think in that moment it may not be fully recognized. At some point in time, everything will find its lane. Everything will find its space, its meaning. The dots will ultimately connect themselves. I don't believe that there's anything that's completely orphaned in the universe. Like, nothing is just in and of itself has no connection to nothing else. Like, everything is connected. Yeah. And so that was dope.
I remember pretty distinctly. I don't remember like the content of any of your work and poetry at that time specifically, but I definitely remember the vibe and I remember the skills. And I remember, man, I might have quit writing poetry after listening to you sometimes. I remember going to this one, I think it was like a poetry slam. I think it was at one of the theaters in College of Charleston.
Right.
And you just destroyed. I don't know if it was a competition. I think it was. I think you won it.
Right.
But I do look back at that moment in time very fondly. And that's cool to hear that, though, also from your perspective, looking back on it, who spent more time in Charleston than I did, because I moved away shortly after that.
Right. I was wondering if that was just like a spot along your journey. Were you there before, after, like you just moved there?
Well,
then
I grew up in Spartanburg.
Okay.
And upstate South Carolina, for folks not familiar with that. And then I went to Tennessee for a little while. I was in school. Then I came to Charleston, and I was there for a few years. And that's when that whole time period I met Simrit there. Now, of course, married to. And it was special, man. That was a special moment and special time period in my life. And definitely there was an energy there. That's interesting to hear, though, from you as well, that that was a moment of time that didn't necessarily continue in the same way. Who was the jazz drummer who was part of that? Quentin,
yeah.
Yeah.
Quentin, and at the time, the backing, correction, let me not say backing band, because they were certainly a feature of their own. Yeah. But the band that was there to support the poets and vice versa was Gradually, and that was Charlton, Quentin, and and Clay, as well as Kevin, who are all four in Ranky Tanky. At one point, I believe,
who just won a Grammy Award, didn't they?
Right, they just won a Grammy Award, and with Kiana, who on vocals. And then at one point, Clay, I believe, went to New York, and Lee Barber started playing guitar in the band, and they were, it was an excellent set. And I mean, shout out to Surmet for even creating a space where that was welcome.
Well, let's take a step back, because where did you grow up in the Low Country of South Carolina? Yeah,
that's home.
Right, because when I was in Charleston, I was always familiar with the Gullah Geechee culture, but on a very superficial level. Like, I knew of its existence, but I didn't know anything of great substance, other than it always was, deeply intriguing, and I knew there was something about it that I didn't know, and that I wanted to know, but my path never allowed me to, or led me to discover it in a deeper way, and that's partly why I'm excited to talk to you today, kind of coming full circle. And so tell us, what was your family like? Like, what is your background in terms of your blood lineage and where you grew up?
Well, it's two parts. As far as my family lineage, the property that we live on, that my family still owns, of course, at one point in time, it was a lot more than what it is now. A lot more property than what it is now. But, over the course of time, eminent domain, gentrification, things like that, financial hard times, a lot of it is whittled away, but there's still a significant enough portion of it left for us to hold on to, has been in the family since just before emancipation. Wow. So we've essentially had it in one way or the other in the family since we were enslaved on it, or in that area. And my family was. And so, of course, a lot of Gullah Geechee people were among the first who were given the opportunity of the freed enslaved, formerly enslaved people to own land. And so, of the people who took advantage of that opportunity, my family was among them. And so that's one of the things that I think really shaped my understanding. It shaped my worldview before I was aware of the world, is growing up in a very insular sort of community because it was a village. Although I was aware of the outside world, the majority of the people that I interacted with, played with, my first best friends and all of that were cousins, all living along the same dirt road in the same rural space. And so the way that, updating to my family structure, the way that I grew up early on would probably be more comparable to someone of my grandparents' era. Because when you're living in rural areas and then you also add, I want to say poverty, but I'm not so sure that that's the word that I'm looking for, because poverty to me has a very, the connotation of it lets you know that it's in the context of capitalism.
Is there a richness that was included in your experience that isn't included in the word of what we think of when we say poverty?
Right.
Yeah.
That is what it is.
Yeah.
And so I think that if I say poverty, the direct thing is it evokes what I didn't have, but that's not where I'm going with it.
Right.
Let's just say financially, when you don't have a lot of the trappings of modernity and, tech and just all those things, material things, it really boils down to a very tangible, attainable lifestyle where you play with dirt, you play with sticks, you climb trees, you actually, your fruits and your snacks are the earth. You eat blackberries and cherries, you climb pecan trees. Like your closeness and oneness with your surroundings are so interconnected. You get water from a well out of the ground. You are playing, your jungle gym is literally the jungle per se. You're swinging on a vine that's actually a vine, not a rope.
Right.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so
you're deeply connected to nature in that case.
Right. So I don't know that that's like that. I would call that poverty. But in the context of the times, it's a time when there are video games and there are,
Right.
there's digital music and all these other things happening outside of that space that it's almost like crossing into a time warp.
About where in the Low Country is this?
I was born in Charleston, but much of the family property that I'm referring to is in Mount Holly. And that's, if I can give you an idea of where that is, if I can give you an idea of where that is, that's probably, do you remember Goose Creek?
Yep.
Okay.
North Charleston. Yep.
Right? Goose Creek and Monk's Corner in Somerville. Okay. It's somewhere in between those areas.
Yeah, that general area.
Yeah. And so, but that's that's the thing is, it's right next to a suburb, like there are suburbs around it, and you would never know that it was there unless you knew that it was there. And many of the kids, I remember going to school that was next to our family land. And there's like an overarching, pathway of trees at the end of the playground. And kids would dare one another, I bet you won't go over there. They'll call it the hole. I bet you won't go over to the hole, and dare each other to see who'll go the closest to the hole. And I'm thinking, that's my uncle's house. Like to them, it's like the Goonies or Stranger Things. Like we'll see what's going to happen.
I see. Oh, you're talking about you're at the school and the kids are saying that
right
about your uncle's house.
Right. We're on the playground and they're looking towards the woods and this arc of trees that goes into the woods. Right. And, daring each other who'll go the closest to the tree.
I'll go.
I know. I was like, what do you want to bet? I'll give you, put it up. I'll bet you a pack of Skittles or whatever. Put it up. I'll go all the way in there. And they're like, no, you won't. Of course, I impressed them, but little do they know I live there. you know? And so you start to become aware of the outside gaze. Like the more you go out, you oh, okay, so you guys don't get water out of the ground. Like, okay, right. I got it. And so that I think that was the perfect start, though, because I've gone on to, I've gone on to travel the world and stay in really nice places and have a really nice place of my own and go on to do all of those things. But underneath all of those experiences and underneath all those trappings and material things is that foundation of earthiness and connection and a desire to be connected with wherever I am. So even if I'm living in a place where there are no trees or there's no place where I can go put my feet on grass, I could only really stay there for so long without having, I don't know, house plants or just some sort of, living green thing around me to help me feel like balanced.
I hope that's some of what we're learning, societally right now, not only with, pandemic where everyone's lives are being forced to become in a certain way more simple. Mm-hmm. And then also when we have in the current Black Lives Matter movement where we as a society, and particularly white America, are learning more about what it means, to be white and what are, and also, how like what you're like we're saying, like a richness that is there with what we typically call poverty, which will be another layer of it that we'll need to get to at some point when we're able to, in terms of whatever this process is of unearthing the obstructions that are there to actually truly have a healthy society. Right. But that class division and seeing that, like when I hear that, it sounds actually quite nice. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Not to create some fairy tale about it. I don't know what it's like. I didn't grow up in the same fashion that you did, but I know when I travel, like in other parts of the world, like you're saying, particularly India, other third world countries, and you see that poverty does not equal misery, not at all. And and the amount of money that you have doesn't equal, and we know that. We've been told that our whole lives, but as a cliche. And in reality, some people with tremendous joy have very little.
Right. And I think that what we have to be mindful of is, in many instances, when having less is associated with some degree of pain or sorrow, it's not that thing by itself that is causing the pain. Like, say, for example, if you can't afford healthcare, not being able to afford healthcare is not the problem. The fact that healthcare costs a premium or costs anything at all is the problem. Not being able to afford nice clothes to impress your classmates is not the problem. The fact that your classmates are materialistic to the degree where they value you less for not having those clothes is the problem. So there are very few things where not having money is in and of itself, by itself, the problem, because ultimately money means nothing. It literally only means what we say it means. If you go in nature and you don't have a capitalist system in place, and you're just living off the land and surviving, money means absolutely nothing. You can use a stack of money to start a fire. It would be more valuable that way than as any kind of currency. Yeah. And so when I look back on virtually all of the things that I would associate with the hard feelings that I had about, growing up, poor, so to speak, it wasn't not having the things that I didn't have. It was the way that people chose to treat me for not having those things. It was the structures that was set in place to punish us for not being more affluent. There were other things, but if you had just left it as just a kid
running down barefoot down a dirt road in the summer. It was sand on the road early on, but, running, down a dirt road in the summer, playing, kickball with his cousins in the woods, picking blackberries, swinging, from tree to tree on vines, sitting in a pecan tree, eating pecans and reading a book, all day. I'm good. That's not a thing that I would feel like I'm not living a full life because of that. It's only when you realize, wait, y'all got Nintendos?
Right.
Hold up, then it's like you start feeling like you're missing out on things. But in and of itself, I've really tried to figure out how to balance ambition. Okay, like how do you tap into a sense of trying to go forward and be somebody, so to speak, without having that turn inward into some sort of, an inner conflict, or having it turn into a burden of some kind where you feel like you have to do these things in order to be validated. Like, how do you get away from that? And I just think that for me, a lot of it just came down to being able to discern what was essential. Once you find this thing of what is essential to your existence, what is essential to the thing that you are trying to manifest, in order for that to happen, what do you need to do that? What is your fuel? And one of the things that really benefited me the most is like actually embracing what I did not have and accepting that it was what it was. Like, I no longer needed, I wasn't going to have the car. You know what I'm saying? Like, I wasn't going to be one of the students that drove to school. My parents didn't have money like that.
Right.
I knew other kids who played instruments. I learned to play instruments by finding an instrument in a department store to play with while my parents were shopping. By going to friends' house who happened to have one and playing it instead of playing with them outside. Or, maybe my brother would have something or buy something and I'd kind of toy with it and tell me, leave his guitar alone. It was always, I never actually owned an instrument until I was a young adult. And so I was an untrained musician who really didn't know how to technically play any of the instruments that I was playing. But I had a strong desire to do it and something to say, something to manifest. And those instruments were the way that I needed to go about doing that. But I needed to overcome the obstacle of not being able to afford one, not being able to have one. And so every opportunity I got a chance to get my hands on one, I would make the most of it. And playing by ear and not having anyone to play along with me, I just worked it out. And so for me, that's kind of like the approach that I utilized in life in general. Before I started, teaching my native language, I grew up hearing that it couldn't be taught because it doesn't have a system.
Right.
It doesn't have rules. It's just broken English. If it could have been done, it would have been done by now. Lots of naysaying about it and telling me what was and wasn't possible with my first language. And I'm like, but then how's it existing all these generations if it can't be taught? Clearly we're teaching it because it's lasting from generation to generation.
Yeah, I think that's such a huge point. Let's stop there and unpack that a little bit. Well, first of all, so Gullah Geechee, that's the name of the language as well, yes? Or no?
Yes, it's the language and the people, the culture, the food. It's all Gullah Geechee.
Yeah, and can you explain to people just first who are the Gullah Geechee people?
All right, this was it's funny you should ask that because I was actually having a conversation with a couple people, and the short answer, okay, the short answer would be that there are people of our ancestry, of African Americans, generational African Americans, who were brought here by way of slavery. Okay. And in that trade, in that slave trade, those people were abducted from the parts of Africa where their skills that they had would make them more valuable laborers in areas of the colonies, such as rice paddies and, being acclimated to swampy sort of areas. So they would go by Ghana, Sierra Leone, different Western, coast of Africa. And so you have that part. But there's also a part of our lineage of people who are indigenous to this land. Now, there are people who debate to what degree, what the percentage of the Gullah Geechee people were here already, what percentage came over as enslaved Africans. There's also a story about 90 some odd years before Jamestown, there were hundreds of enslaved Africans who liberated themselves and went out into the wilderness, never to be seen again, and were believed to have gone to have collaborated with the indigenous people who were here and gone into what is now considered like the Gullah corridor, that these were the free Black people who were here. There's documented that there were people, when the colonists came here, they were saying, hey, there are already free Black people here. Huh. And so that's the internal debate amongst, Gullah Geechee people as to whether or not they were the Guale people who lived near the Ogeechee River, that's where it came from. The Gullah and Ogeechee went on to be Gullah Geechee, but there's also the Gullah Geechee people in Africa, where it's Gola Kissi, as opposed to Guale, Ogeechee people by the river. So there's a debate about how many of us came from what part, but the bottom line is we're definitely a collective of those people. Mm-hmm. And so the reason that's important is you can tell by the language where the influences lie, because we have words, hundreds of words in our vocabulary that are clearly from African languages. They're clearly from African languages, as well as indigenous words that were from indigenous tribes that were here that are also in our language. In fact, there are some of the words and names that people think are like Black names, Shaniqua, are not actually just like made up, so-called Black names, African names, whatever. They're actually indigenous names. And so
makes sense.
I try to, the reason I say this funny you asked is because I've wanted to be able to explain that a little bit more. This format seems like the right place to do it because you have a little bit more time to unpack it than giving the usual, 10-second response that's almost guaranteed to make no one happy.
Right. 5-minute news clip. Yeah.
Right. They'll be like, why didn't you mention the indigenous? Or why didn't you mention this? Or why didn't you? It's like, listen, I really only had, so much time to work with. Right. But at any rate, though, so there's that. There's the, short answer being that there's Afro-Indigenous people, some of whom were here and some of whom were brought over from Africa, came together in the Barrier Islands, on the Barrier Islands, and in the Low Country, in an area that ranges from about the Capes of North Carolina, about, Wilmington, Jacksonville, North Carolina, inland about 30 miles. And then there's a strand that stretches all the way from there through North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, down to the top of Florida, about Jacksonville. Mm-hmm. And that strip of area where there's the highest concentration of Gullah Geechee people. And those people have contributed mightily to what we consider American history, not just Black history or Gullah history, but these are people and, who have contributed in ways that even militarily, there are people like, say, John Horse and the Seminoles who fought in the Gullah Wars, or they were called the Indian Wars, but they were the Gullah Wars, that would fought the United States government to a standstill. And so when you hear people like Kanye say, oh, well, slavery was a choice, we never, rebelled, like that's absolutely not true. People might have heard of Nat Turner. They might have heard of, little smaller rebellions, but this is all out war with the Gullah Geechee people, or the Maroons, people who were called Maroons, that were were formerly enslaved people, collaborating with indigenous people and fighting the United States government and military to exist.
What time period is that?
Well, that's the thing, is that the preceding the Civil War, take a look at what you would call like the Indian Wars, like what had been presented as the United States fighting solely Indians. And I use their term, obviously indigenous peoples, but they were referring to like the Indian Wars. Mm-hmm. In those wars were Gullah Geechee people fighting in those wars. And so people will ask that, well, wait a minute, when did that happen? I'm saying it's literally right in front of your face. It's just being given a different name so that they don't acknowledge that it wasn't just the indigenous people that come to mind who were on those battlefields. Hmm. And so when that ends up happening, and you have people who, even on the Trail of Tears, there were people who were Gullah Geechee people who were marooned from formerly enslaved people who had fought alongside the indigenous people for their freedom, and they were on the Trail of Tears. Now, some of them, quite frankly, were enslaved by the indigenous tribes. Mm. Others had a rank and role in the community of those tribes. Mm-hmm. It depends, because not all the tribes were on the same page in regards of slavery. Sure. Yeah. But there is a significant part of that history that is missing, to the point where we're only told that we were brought here in chains. Mm. The fast history that we're taught about Gullah Geechee people is, you were slaves, you were brought here, you were worked a slave, set free, like, white people set you free, Lincoln, and then you were,
I don't mean to laugh, but it's just, yeah.
And then I guess some people just think we just went into the woods like leprechauns and just turned into fairies or something in the trees. Like we just went extinct. They'll ask me like, where can I find some Gullah Geechee people? I'm like, what are you talking about, bro? Like right there at the Circle K, at the Kroger's grocery store. Like, what are you talking about? They're all around you.
Well, it's so, complex or even muddy. There's so many layers of it. First of all, like when we're kids, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, it seems like, just forever ago. And then when you get a little older, you realize that, oh, this just happened. Right. This just took place. And the residue of it is just right here. Then on top of that, the history we learned in schools, the mainstream narratives that's taught in so-called social studies and so forth, is entirely jaded. And so I think historical context, that's a big part of what we're learning right now.
Right. And how far back can it possibly be if millions of formerly enslaved people's descendants still bear the names of their masters? Mm. You see what I'm saying? Like if your family line is still named Jefferson, Johnson, Jackson, Washington, or whatever the name was, like Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali's name, didn't just come from his father or his grandfather. It was actually from the person who owned his great grandfather or something like that.
Yeah.
And so can you imagine if after the Holocaust, okay, during the Holocaust, many of the people who were in those camps were branded with tattoos.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you imagine 100 years later, the descendants of those people still passing that tattoo down from generation to generation and identifying by it? And if someone suggested that they should probably not do it, they become almost angry and defensive. And by identifying as that thing, because that's their family tattoo.
Right.
I mean,
Why would you change your name? Right. Why can't you just have your name?
Right.
That's interesting.
And so
putting it as
people
a brand.
think about that. Right. And so I'm like, and I know that some people will say, oh man, that's offensive. But think about what I'm saying. How is it different in the sense that your name was marking you as that person's property? They weren't taking your name from you and giving you his name because it just has a nice razzle dazzle to it. That was the sign to other people that you belong. If I take you into my possession and take you as my property, and from now on we're calling you Jidev Michaud, and that's what your kids are going to be called, and your kids' kids, and your kids' kids. Okay. Why wouldn't it be logical for someone in your line at some point in time to say, hey man, this doesn't really make sense to me?
That's a real powerful way to say it, man. Even you just saying that to me, I can feel the depth of how fucked up it is.
It is. Yeah. It is. But what's even more so is that over the course of time, you can kind of bamboozle and oppress people to embrace their oppression as self-expression. And that's the part that really, really gets me, is like, how far back are we really talking if some of our grandparents or great-grandparents were either enslaved or freshly out of slavery? I have people in my family who've lived to be centurions, who lived to be over 100 years old. And some of them can still tell stories of either, slavery. It's like firsthand accounts of slavery, if not themselves, but firsthand accounts of people who were. And they tell that story to my grandparent. Now think about your grandparent. If your grandparent can tell you a story of something that someone told them from a firsthand witness of slavery, how far back was it?
Yesterday.
Right. Yeah. And so that's what I'm speaking of Black Lives Matter. That's what I think this isn't just a moment for Black people. We've done this. You see what I'm saying? We've in the Gullah Wars, we fought for our freedom. In rebellions, we fought for our freedom. We fought for our freedom in the Civil War. We got out to Reconstruction. We ascended into the ranks of society, showed what we were made of, had that taken from us. The South reverts back to where it was. We, again, each case, Jim Crow, we show our mettle there. We have Rosewood, we have, in Tulsa, Black Wall Street, we build ourselves up again and again and again. Formerly enslaved people continuing to prove our worth and evolving with each generation. Okay. On the other hand, white people are the least evolved demographic in the society for the same reason that the shark hasn't had to really do too much evolving since the prehistoric days. It doesn't have a natural predator.
I see.
It is the apex predator at the top of the food chain. Same reason crocodiles and alligators look a lot like their prehistoric version of themselves, because they don't have anything that's hunting them, that's forcing them to adapt to their surroundings.
I never thought about that in that way.
Right. So now what we see happening now is the atmosphere around whiteness is changing to a point where, like, whoa, now we have to adapt. Yeah. And this is a weird feeling.
Yes.
You see what I'm saying? And so now Black Lives Matter, in a sense, yes, it is for us, but remember, they're taking down the Calhoun. They're finally taking down the Calhoun statue.
Wow, right in central Charleston there.
in the wake of a black man being murdered in Minnesota.
Right.
So now ask yourself, why was it when Walter Scott was murdered in Charleston years ago, why didn't they take it down then?
Was that the brother in North Charleston got chased down?
Right.
Yeah. Or how about a couple years ago at the
Emmanuel
Church?
Emmanuel 9, yeah. And so when there was a massacre, literally right a stone's throw from the statue, they didn't do it then. But what's happened now is that the climate is changing.
There's some catalyst, some deeper evolutionary intelligence that boom.
Right, and I'm glad you said that. It's not just revolutionary, it's evolutionary.
It is evolutionary. This is in my perspective, that's why I love what's happening right now. I'm not in the sense I love people being in pain or nothing like that, but this is a love movement in my perception. It is its engine, I believe, at the very center of it. And that's not any person, any one individual, not any one organization, nothing like that. But at the very center of it, it's engined by a love intelligence. That is the very force of evolution itself.
Right. And with me, I'm a little slightly left of center when I say this, but I actually applaud self-preservation in the minds of people who haven't actually evolved willingly. They're not doing it out of love. They're doing it because they don't want to lose all their money, or they're doing it because they don't want to, suffer the consequences. And you know what? That works too. As long as you are no longer engaging in oppression, as long as you are no longer, there's this thing, fake it till you make it. Well, you know what? If you are practicing humanity, if you're hungry and I'm only feeding you because I want to feel better about myself, your stomach doesn't know the difference. Your belly doesn't know that it has food in it because of my intentions. And so to some degree, I don't really need or even seek for people who have biases or bigotry within them. You can have them. You can keep them. You can hold on to them. If that's what keeps you warm at night, knock yourself out. But what you can't do is put your knee in my neck for 8 minutes and 36 seconds. That part you can't do. You can't call the police on me for, barbecuing or, breathing while black. Like you can't just, these things, right. You can't do that part. But if you just want to hold on to your ideas, your beliefs, or whatever, have at it. But at some point in time, self-preservation will kick in and you will realize you can no longer do the things that you used to do. Like these ain't the good old days. And you will have to practice a higher vibration of behavior. And that's where we will get our progress will come from a change in your behavior and a change in your actions, not necessarily a change in your beliefs or your sense or sensibilities, but actions. Because there were lots of good, quote, white folk who did not agree with slavery, but wouldn't bust a grape in a food fight to stop it.
Sure. Well, except when that self-preservation is institutionalized, of course, then it's...
Yeah, that's predatory.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a predatory thing. That once you start making it a structural form of oppression, you're no longer even talking about self-preservation, because most of that is greed. Like capitalism isn't even based on need. Capitalism is based on greed, because like, there's no reason for a billionaire. You know what I'm saying? Like, a billionaire doesn't exist in the wild. There's no billionaire in the animal kingdom. You know, I mean, how many times have you ever seen like a bear forage food for hibernation and it's just falling out of the cave, like just food, just, like there are no squirrels.
Only like Winnie the Pooh,
right? Come on, like that's not what they do. Like this isn't really like a natural instinct to be a billionaire. Once you start getting to that level, you're doing something else other than preserving yourself.
Well, this reminds me of a question I actually wanted to ask you about Gullah Geechee culture, because when I think of that, I think of what, the only reason we would have inclinations, even if there is a capitalist system, and that's another discussion for another day, going into all the depths of that. But when the society is not built upon spiritual principles, not spiritual principles just in philosophy or religious ideals that are then projected onto the people, but actual principles that are alive within the culture, which is a very different thing. And that's one other thing I thought of when you talked about, you know, white folks not having a predator, and then black folks always had the entire black experience in this country, always being in that position. And gosh, it sure seems to be the case that, you know, the great arts that we've all benefited from black people, black music, across the board. You know, if you inspect our music, you can't find any American music that's not black. You just can't. And anyhow, out of that pain and out of that suffering emerges a certain type of greatness that we've all benefited from. Anyhow,
absolutely.
So what is this? What is the spirit? What has been the spirituality of the Gullah Geechee people?
Well, it's one of the things that's often said about Gullah Geechee people is that we have over time managed to preserve more of our Africanness, so to speak, than any other subset of the African American community. Now, that is not to say that we're blacker than everyone else. That's a whole completely different concept altogether. And speaking of, you know, unpacking race as a social construct. So yeah, no, that's not the thing. But many of the beliefs were sometimes preserved in ways that were not overt on the surface. Like, say, for example, in the Christianity or religiosity, rather, is a major part of Gullah Geechee culture. In part because the only literature that slavers allowed enslaved people to, well, not necessarily read, but to consume was the Bible. Of course, a heavily edited so-called slave Bible that removed all the rebellions and, you know, escape from Egypt. You know, all that was just taken out. But,
oh, really? I didn't realize that.
Yes, if you look at I believe in the African American Museum, you'll see what's called a slave Bible, and it's like a pamphlet because everything's taken out of it except, you know, slave obey your master and things that were actually conducive to their agenda,
their narrative, right?
So even so, after generations of being fed that version of the Bible, even when you get access to the full Bible itself, your perception and the context of how you view it, like that it's in, you still view it in the context that it was delivered to you. So it's almost like you watch a movie and then you see the director's cut. Your frame of reference for that movie is still the original 90-minute movie. So even if the director's cut is 2 hours or 2.5 hours, your reference is still the original version of it with some other stuff added into it. And so that's kind of how it was when we transitioned from the slave Bible to the full-on, you know, Bible. Now, the reason I say that is because all along we had been holding on to our pre-slavery religions and means of worship and connection to the earth and our different ways that we could, you know, play our instruments and do our dances and become overtaken by the Spirit in ways that was not the case in white churches. So even when given Christianity, it was like, whoa, what is this Africanized version? Like, what? That's not what we do. Like, we politely golf clap in church, and you know, that's not how you guys are churching wrong. You know, but what we're doing is using it as a Trojan horse for our beliefs and our practices. Now, of course, there's some cross-contamination because you can't completely, get that out of there. But that's what we had been doing. And so there are traditions. I remember being passed over, a coffin as a child. And that's not a Christian practice. Like, so, I guess the belief is that you do that so that the spirit would be at rest and not come back and, haunt the child. And so there are things like that you would say, whoa, where did, what part of the Bible did this come from? And what's happening there is these are your African and indigenous practices and belief being preserved in the culture. And even now, again, whether it's religious or not religious, there's a certain intuitiveness, a certain connection that people have when we communicate with one another, whether it's communicating directly or verbally, or just sometimes things you just know. And I've been in situations where I can turn to another person and just give them that look, and they're like, and we all like have communicated the whole conversation just now with just a little look, true. And that's it. That's a whole conversation right there.
Cultural body language, yeah.
Right. Just a facial expression, body language. It could be any small little gesture or a sound, and and that ties into what you were just saying before about how having to evolve and having to adapt led us to always being innovative in every level, whether it's innovative in music and arts and sciences, medicine and communication, in language, linguistics. We've had to evolve in many instances. Even in our song, many of those songs were sang as code for other operations or other parts of our lives. Like, okay, this we sing this song as a song of freedom, as in we're literally delivering a message of where we're going to be, wade in the water, we're escaping by water, things like that. And also using those songs as cadence, as means of keeping our meter on one onto the other as we work together in sequence in order to be able to stay in line with one another, to be able to work smarter, not harder. So we find all of these ways of innovating and connecting with one another on more than just a verbal level, but being almost spiritually in tune with one another. I don't know that can be maintained to the degree that it has been were it not for the geographical barriers. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know that you can just kind of have that and be like a New Yorker. Like, we're both New Yorkers and you're from one borough, I'm from another. And then we have like that link because we're both from this massive city. I think that a portion of it is because in many areas, people are actually from more self-contained cells, self-contained communities where they have a chance to really, develop synchronicity with one another on a community level. And because you have a similar pattern or a similar foundation of doing that in different Gullah communities, even when I encounter someone who's from a Gullah community that is not my own, there's already like a there. There's already a thing for us to build on.
Yeah, beautiful. Talk to us about the language, because that'll lead us into, at least some of the important current work you're doing. So use that as your native language, first language, and do you consider it's a different language? How is it defined, like in relationship to, say, English?
Oh, it's literally a language. It's defined in the same. Gullah is to English what English is to Latin, or English is to Germanic, or what I'm saying, like, or Portuguese is to Spanish. Like, there are languages that have similarities. Yeah. Languages that have encountered one another. Yeah. They've encountered one another and they share properties. Yeah. And so with English and the African and indigenous languages that all came together and created a separate language that has rules of its own. It's a rule-governed language, just like English is, but it's a rule-governed language that has its own grammar, And I think what throws people off is that because it started out as a pidgin and evolved into a Creole, and from a Creole to what, I mean, a Creole is a form of language, but still it evolved into where it is now with an independent language of its own. I think that people, they hear the similarities, and if they can understand enough of it, they don't think that it's a separate language.
Right.
Because to them, they've been trained to believe that if something is a foreign language, you won't be able to know what it says. Someone communicates, you wouldn't be able to know what it says. And so you think like French and Spanish, like, oh, I can't understand anything that someone says in, Italian without knowing it. But is that really true? Because they're European languages of neighboring countries that are different languages, but you can probably have a conversation with just enough words between them to communicate some basic thoughts and ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also levels to each language. There's acrolec, mesolec, and basolec. Acrolec would be the least infused. Like, think of it as elementary, intermediate, advanced. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
But turned upside down.
All right.
Okay? Elementary in language is usually the most basic form and like the easiest, I suppose, to learn. The least confounded language, least complex. In language as it pertains to Gullah juxtaposed to English or Patois or Creole or Bahamian Creole, Guyanese, all these things, as they are compared to English, the advanced would be the least English influenced. Do you see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So whereas in English, it is the most basic form of the language, cat, dog, house, mouse, what we would teach children, that would be like your most basic, and advanced would be the really wordy, eloquent, sort of
more sophisticated
words, sophisticated words. Mm-hmm. Okay. In Gullah, it's the opposite. If you are speaking Gullah and you're speaking acrolec, then what you're speaking is essentially accented English. That's basically the way that I'm speaking now, but with a little bit of this right here, this right y'all mixing in it. Your boy, I understand why he's saying, with that mixed in it would be more acrolec, mesolec.
Right.
I could have a conversation with you and you'll understand why he's saying. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
But if I really I want for crop keep with on it in baselect form, you wouldn't understand what I was saying. Because I'm now switching to a completely different vocabulary, for the most part, different grammar rules, word order, things of that nature. I'm now changing the rules of the game. I'm now, instead of using like past and present tense, are no longer based on like the suffix like ed at the end of something. It's not like talk. It stays to talk, but now it's based on something else. So if I say somebody did do something, that means it's a present progressive, that they've done it and they do it generally. So you could swap that out for like always. If I say somebody had do something, that means that it's a past tense. They had do that, as in they did it in the past. If I say someone do, that means that they are either doing it right now or correction. That means that they're doing it right now. Someone do means that they are going to do it in the future. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. And so the add, ga, with the same word that never changes its tense, the same verb, determines whether it's past, present, future, or present progressive. That's not an accident. Like, that's not something that doesn't have a system to it. It's just that people hadn't broken down the system and said, hey, I think we can make this make sense to one another. And then largely in part because we didn't need to, because the language wasn't allowed in classes. It wasn't accepted in professional spaces. So it's not like no one was curious about it, or we weren't going to learn it or to break it down in that form. It's just that that's not the way we taught our kids.
Right.
you see what I'm saying? Like it was
just like I
down
didn't teach
orally.
my son how to talk in that way either.
Right.
You talk, you speak, and they learn.
Right. Exactly.
Well, this is, I think it's so important because, as you mentioned earlier, of course, you know, via the lens of white body, the supremacy of this false idealism of a white body and everything that flows out of that.
Right.
Then we would hear, if we would hear someone speaking Gullah in any of those levels, but particularly where we can understand a little bit of it, but any of it,
right.
That's like, well, that's broken English. That it gets contextualized, and I've been reading this book, My Grandmother's Hands. A lot of people reading it right now by the brother, his name Resma Menakov, I believe is his name.
Uh-huh.
He makes a brilliant point saying how trauma decontextualizes history. And so then everything, the lens in which we're, you know, listening to, seeing things, hearing things, it's all, you know, just like we were saying earlier, if we don't have the context, the proper context of history, we will misunderstand actually what's happening right now.
Right, right.
And so hearing like Gullah Geechee, and then it being just contextualized as like some lesser than, something something that's broken English. But now fast forward to today, and you're teaching it at Harvard University as a language. How did that come about?
Well, two things about that is that all language is a product of a predecessor or predecessors. Mm-hmm. And in linguistics, there's just a lot of room for racism. Because racism and classism, because people seem to think English came into existence by way of immaculate conception. Like, you know, it just popped out into existence whole.
Right.
And this is the way that it sounds.
Yeah.
Like that's not what happened. And so you have to ask yourself, why is it other languages? Why do the Romance languages get to derive from other languages that came before it and be seen as legitimate languages?
Right.
But the languages of the peoples of color, the subjugated people who were colonized by these oppressors, why did those languages, why are they relegated to being something substandard or less, or broken versions of their lexifiers? The lexifiers being the language of the colonizer. That's not how, and you know, you only hear people say, oh, well, if this didn't happen in World War II or whatever, all the French would be speaking German. So you clearly understand how language moves across the globe and the tie-in that colonization and domination and conquest has into who speaks what language. So you're aware of that part. And yet we speak a so-called standard English in America that does not sound like the standard English in UK, the empire that brought these Americans here. So the Americans do not speak with a British accent. The Americans do not use, when they say garage, they don't say garage, you know? Right. And so, but yet here in America, we get to say, nah, we're going to spell flavor with an O-R, not an O-U-R. That's going to be proper here, even though the O-U-R is proper there, and both get to coexist as proper. But if you come up with a third language of your own that happens to have relation to this thing we're calling English, even though they sound completely different, but this thing we're calling English, well, then that's going to have to get filed underneath one of these languages as a broken version of it. You can't do those. You can't utilize your own rules. And this is just the way that we treat the people who speak those languages. Yeah. And so in that regard, the whole idea of broken English or Gullah being broken English, that's rooted in white supremacy. Yeah. That's rooted in imperialism, colonialism, and just good old-fashioned white supremacy. But if you keep repeating it enough, even the speakers of the language will believe it.
Of course, that's how the mind works.
Right. Yeah. And so what ended up happening here is it's a weird sort of thing. You can accept that something is a reality, but not your reality at the same time. Where you may, whenever I see you, be hostile and go out of your way to create a negative vibe. So technically, we're enemies. Not because I'm your enemy, but because the way that you're approaching me has created a relationship that is that of a person who's been turned into, like, a hostile relationship. So I can accept that you are my enemy and fully embrace that I am not yours at the same time. You see what I'm saying? Even though these two things are connected, because whether I'm yours or not, I'm still going to have to deal with the energy that you bring to the table. You see what I'm saying? So I say that to say, I can accept that this is the perception of the language. I don't deny that that's the reality. I don't deny that, and I don't tell my students that, hey, you're going to be able to walk into this bank or into this job interview and talk like this onto the job interview, and he's like, oh man, I'm so impressed with your Gullah Geechee. Like, sure, you can have the job. That's probably not the reality, but it can be a part of the reality that we bring forth if we
become that.
If we defiantly speak the language. But currently, there's nobody out here hoping that they're Geechee enough to get to land, to ace an interview. Right. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's not how that's working. We're taught to code switch.
So who did put so when you're teaching it and you are teaching it with, like, all right, there are rules, there is a structure to it, or certainly there is, otherwise it wouldn't work.
Right.
And so did you unpack that? Did you kind of get in there and kind of reverse engineer it?
Yes, because it didn't exist.
Right. That's amazing.
And now I want to be careful when I say that, because there was scholarly work that had been done about the language. Lorenzo Dow Turner, who's considered like the godfather of Gullah academics and Gullah scholarship. So there was definitely scholars who had done work and had work that I would be able to refer back to in regards of unpacking the language on an academic level. But what wasn't there was like the reference books, the rules, the pedagogy on how to actually teach the language, like not talking about the language, but literally how do I turn this into a curriculum and pass it on? That I hadn't seen. And so I was having to apply, remember, I have to teach myself, all of what I know. I teach myself, graphic designing, photography, music, filmmaking, writing, all of that in order to just survive and just, create, educate, innovate, to move forward. That's a part of my culture. And so I applied the same principle to the language. And it starts with what you already know. And I say, what do I already know about language? That's the first, not Gullah Geechee, but what do I already know about language? How is language taught? How is language passed on? How does it come into existence? How do people treat it? The different levels of that language, casual spaces, professional spaces. How would I say good morning to my mother as opposed to good morning to my homeboy? Like, these are different ways. Like, you can walk into a room and tell if someone's on the phone with their girlfriend or if they're on the phone with their manager. And so when you start really, really deconstructing that and seeing what all the pieces are and how it can be put back together again, that's where the curriculum that I'm working with now came from. And I'm continuing to grow it because...
How long have you been teaching it now?
3 years. It's been a few years now.
Uh-huh.
And so, but what's important about that though is the more you put it in front of real people, real live people, like not theory in your head and how it should work out, but once you've seen people react to it, people learn it, and gotten the results of what's the best teaching form, and some of the best material to bring that out of them, you can improve. You can say, okay, well, I think maybe they were more confused by this than that, so let me adjust. And fortunately, you have the students going from AA, AB, BA, BB, et cetera, like going through the full curriculum. So whereas my AA students...
Yeah, is it undergraduate work you're doing at Harvard?
Both.
Yeah.
You can be graduate and undergraduate.
Uh-huh.
And so in my situation, I'm able to say, if I start with you in AA and work through our entry level things, and then each level, I try to make sure that you have a contained package of, if you left then, it wouldn't be like, oh, you should have come back next semester if you really wanted the secret recipe. You know,
you have some sense of holistic education at each level.
Right. It's each level that you achieve, that's the thing that has value in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that being able to find a way that is both intellectually rigorous, because it is Harvard and it can't just be something where literally just anyone could do it with little to no effort. It has to be something that is challenging.
Right.
But at the same time, I try to make it something that also feels intuitive. I try to draw from what you already know and make use of that to help you learn a new thing. If that makes any sense.
It does make sense. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, so how did that, and I know we won't be able to get into your whole story this session, but how did that arrive? How did you end up at Harvard teaching it?
Clay, speaking of Clay from Ranky Tanky, and I went to see them play when they were here in Boston, and he asked me the same thing, like, no, but seriously. I said, well, Jimi Hendrix, wasn't a learned musician, and yet he was one of the greatest. He said, yeah, but that's rock and roll. This is like the Philharmonic. Like, how did you end up in the Philharmonic?
Exactly.
Of academia. But no, you know what it is it's preparedness and opportunity with a little bit of serendipity. I happen to already have had much of what I'm teaching and working on. I had already been working on that, like, is cultural advocacy, like being an advocate for my culture and how I can help to preserve it and push it forward and be a representative, and whether it's the language, the music, the culture. So that was already in place. And Professor Magani, who's dope, the department head of African Languages program, was familiar already with Gullah and had wanted to introduce it to the language program. But one of the things, which I think is brilliant on his part, that he wanted was, and this is for all of his languages, he likes for the person who's instructing other people on the language to be a native speaker. Like, that's not just someone who picked it up from somewhere, but someone who knows from the cradle, from the crib, the language, the ins and outs on a native level, which I do. And so when the situation came that, and also you have to have some academic, reason for taking these classes. And so when the situation arose that a student wanted to take the Gullah class and one did not exist, I was able to be in the position to interview with him. I initially thought that I would probably be giving counseling or some sort of advisor, they just bring in someone to say, hey, who do you know? Do you know someone? And I don't know if I've ever mentioned this or not, but I actually even dropped a few names of who could possibly be some options to work with for the class, because at the time that wasn't what I was doing. I was working in a different field. And when we sat down and had a conversation, I started unpacking the language and talking about it and teaching different parts and how to condense this phrase, translating it from English to Gullah, and how within Gullah we can utilize loan words and English words in a way that are not intuitive to English speakers in order to create a new thing. And then, so when you sit down and you have a conversation like that, I think that to, not to speak for him, but to Professor Magani's credit, he was able to say, wait a minute, what are you doing? Teach me some more of this thing. And he said, I'll tell you what, why don't you come back and we'll continue this even further, like, a mock class per se. I'd like to see you do this with at the time, the preceptor, who is himself a linguistic scholar, to essentially give you the once over to see if you really know what you're doing and how much of a command do you have of the subject. And so we did that again. And I think that's when he essentially just said, look, if you're available and open to doing this, from what I've seen, I think you're capable of really doing something special here. And would you be interested? And I think that I think at the time I was probably a little bit caught off guard, not because I didn't think that I wouldn't be able to do it or that Gullah didn't deserve it. It's just that I had become so accustomed to Gullah not being given a fair shake in the context of academia, to the language being looked down on and frowned on and seen as less than. So to encounter someone, especially someone that credible, that reputable, that someone who literally wrote the book on Swahili.
At an institution like Harvard.
Right. At an institution like Harvard, you do have to stop and pause and just really take in that moment, because it felt like a lot of things had come full circle, because I do remember being in classes and having teachers not only correct my grammar, but just my accent. I could actually say a sentence that was actually grammatically correct by English standards, but she just didn't like the way that I pronounced the word tomato,
Right.
or the way that I, if I said,
She wanted you to say tomato.
Bounce the ball, bounce the ball, man. And he said, no, don't say bounce, say bounce. Or
Right.
street or screet. And they're like, wait a minute, but if you understood what I'm saying, if you can understand a kid well enough to say, no, the word is street, not screet. Well, then you clearly understood what I said. If you were able to give me the English version of that word, then you knew what I said. Why do you need to correct even my accent? And so of course the answer is racism, but still, even in that moment, all of that comes back. All of that comes back when you're sitting there and you're saying, wow, I think I just might have landed this like historic gig at this institution for a language that up until now hadn't been welcomed in these halls. Although Lorenzo Dow Turner was himself a Harvard grad and went on to be the person who founded Gullah Studies, that's not what he did there.
Right, but still, right.
And so that was something that I think I probably didn't fully recognize the magnitude of it until word got out.
That's powerful, man. That's really,
right.
That's very
right.
powerful, man.
Right. The community response to it was, now of course there were some people who had some misgivings about it, and I understood that.
In the Gullah community?
Yeah, I mean, because you don't, some of them didn't know me, and we didn't know, they don't know if like Harvard's about to take over,
right?
The language, whatever. A similar thing happened when Jamaican Patois came to Harvard. Like people in these communities and people who are the speakers of these Creoles or West African Pidgin, when the language still lives and breathes among real people in the communities, like not so big, we're very protective of it, and want to know who's this dude, like someone that I consider a friend, KJ Kearney, had hit me up like, hey, I'd like to meet you, sit down, have some coffee, and see what's up with you, basically. And he was one of the only, if not the only person who maybe was skeptical or had some misgivings about it, that actually invited me to sit down, and turned out to be a real solid dude, and vice versa. And we've, gone on to do a lot of, really great things together. And most of the people who were skeptical early on, I think I've had conversations with since then. And I think that they're now, won over. You know what I'm saying? Like they might have not known for sure what was going to be what, but I think at this point I've managed to represent the culture and the language faithfully and respectfully enough for them to be at peace with what I'm doing there.
Yeah, beautiful. It's a beautiful story, man. What is, like, just to wrap it up here a little bit, and to wrap it up, and then I'll give some big question, but just to, not to ask a question that may seem obvious to some, but really just to hear from your mind, like, why is it important that you're teaching this language?
I think that it's important because of a few reasons. My course at Harvard is not necessary for the language to continue to exist. Mm-hmm. Okay? So, I mean, that would be really almost arrogant of me to say that if I don't do this course, the language is going to die after generations of it existing without the course existing. So when I say language preservation, I don't want to send the message that when I say this is a part of language preservation, the Gullah preservation of the language, that what I mean is taking this course is a means of preserving the language, because I can only, at Harvard, teach Harvard students.
Meaning, and, like, it adds a vitality.
Right. Mm-hmm. But what it does do is I think it raises the level of visibility and even validity in certain circles of the language to the point where we can all collectively benefit from that. Yes. So it's not just me. Mm-hmm. I think it makes it easier for an educator in Charleston County to say, I would like to introduce more Gullah Geechee to the curriculum for my students. And when they're met with resistance, for them to be able to say, well, it's being done at Harvard.
Yeah.
Or, are you sure that this can be done? Well, it's been working successfully for X amount of years at Harvard. And so I think that is the thing, like having it in a place where other people, besides myself, other people are able to utilize that momentum and utilize that acceptance into that level of academia. It helps it be able to gain the respect and the acceptance in the circles where we've been denied, while at the same time being passed on in our own inner circles where those things don't matter.
Right. And just as like a lack of education for the awareness of the language and it being a legit language with its own sophistication and its own intelligence and its own culture and its own spirit. It seems to me that just as that the lack of that awareness becomes a vehicle for racism, the education of the goodness of the language and the intelligence and the spirit of it seems to me is also the education of it is the vehicle for anti-racism as well.
Right. And I always try to make sure that I underscore the point that the value is added in both directions.
Yes.
You see, while there is value added in regards of the stature of Gullah Geechee language to the world by being aligned with Harvard, Harvard itself has been around since before this country was this country. Okay, since it's older than America. So, which means Harvard was here for the whole deal.
Yeah, right.
The slavery, it was here. And so all the things that Black America went through, Harvard was there for it. And in many instances, benefiting from it. And Harvard knows that they have some recompense to pay, some righting of the ship, some reconciling to do. There are things that, I mean, once you're that big, I don't know that you can ever truly make it right in the eyes of many people, no matter what you do. But the effort on their part to try incrementally in different ways to get it right will fall apart if they don't have willing partners to open spaces to them to try. You see, the African language program at Harvard is the biggest in the world. More languages, more students, whatever, in the biggest department of its kind in the world. And I see on my day-to-day basis more Black people than I will see out in the actual city where I live. So there's a community on campus, there's a presence on campus. I see these hallways teeming with Black people. And so the image that people have when they think of Harvard isn't that. They don't think in terms of people of color, but there's a lot happening in the hallways and the campuses of Harvard that many people may not be aware of. And things like this course, things like other, Black alumni and, just these things help to raise up the awareness that Harvard is doing things to kind of contribute and get it right. It'll never be perfect, and there will always be something, and I concede that. But at the very least, the attempt to add value to the lives and education and communities of people of color, and for people of color to be able to get, that for that to be a reciprocal symbiotic relationship, there is a lot of that is there. And so, we benefit, we're in a sense, like we say, take hand to wash hand, we are benefiting mutually. So having these things at their disposal helps to give them more of the look that they're going for, regardless of which department it's in. And I think benefiting from that brand, as far as the people of color, that's the very least that we can do, because we built Harvard. We literally built Harvard. You see what I'm saying? So the very least that Harvard can do in certain instances is avail itself to the people of color, be they African-American, Africans, et cetera, particularly generational African-Americans who built their establishment. So to me, this is a perfect match. Now, I will say, some people will ask, well, why didn't you go to this HBCU or that HBCU? The answer is very simple. They didn't call.
Right.
Yeah, Harvard called first.
Yeah.
And I hope that it working at Harvard and me being able to do what I'm doing at Harvard, I hope it does open up the interest or curiosity for other courses in different schools, HBCUs or otherwise, to teach the language, not just teach about the language or the language's history, but actually teach the language like French, Spanish, et cetera, to teach the language. I would love that. I would welcome that. I would be more than down to contribute whatever I could to that happening elsewhere.
Right. Well, give thanks, man. Congratulations on the developments. Well deserved. At least you've always been a wordsmith. I've known that. You've always had that gift of the kind of wisdom sword coming, how you were able to use language. In the case, when we were hanging out 20 years ago at, poetry events and so forth.
Yeah.
You did that. You always use language in order to like change our consciousness, and here you are like doing, and as am I actually, in a different expression, using language to shift consciousness a little bit.
Right. And about that, I'm glad you said that, because I can see where what we're doing, where we are and who we are, is so connected to where we were and who we are, who we were, that it's in many instances, people say, oh, that was a lifetime ago. That was another me. And it's not like we've suddenly become like a whole different thing, like a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. It's not like another me. I'm literally an evolution of where I was. I've evolved to where I am now. And you're either evolving or devolving in some way, shape, or form, but it's growth either way. And so the way that I've seen you encompass where you are now, I could imagine, like, put it this way, I'm not surprised that you are where you are and who you are. You're doing what you're doing. Like, I'm not surprised, because even in that stage, in that phase of where you were as a person, I always imagined that this is the type of path or journey that you would pursue, because you really exuded a light that could not be denied. Like, there's no way that's going to just flame out.
Yeah, I give thanks.
So it was dope. It's dope to see you doing what you're doing. Enjoyed the conversation, of course. You definitely don't have to ask me twice to hold the conversation with you, because like you just said, it's time flies, man. And I'm appreciative to be here. Would be glad to do it again.
Likewise, man. Definitely appreciate the education as well. Thank you for sharing, about your people and helping us to understand our history better. And,
right. I probably rambled a lot through all of this, because it's, in conversation form. I don't know how you're going to edit this later.
We're not editing it. No, it's perfect. It just came out perfect.
Yeah.
All right, brother.
All right, no doubt.
Much thanks. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast, everyone. Really appreciate you being here. Thank you again to Sunn. Really appreciate Sunn being on the podcast. Really enjoyed talking to him, learning from him. Definitely check him out on his social media, Instagram, Twitter, Sunn Show. Just click in the description of this podcast and you can link over and be able to follow him. SUNNMCHEAUX is how you spell it out. Thank you again to the Life Force Academy for making this podcast possible, and the whole Life Force Academy team. And thank you to Simrit for providing us always with such superb sound current. And as promised, we're going to be playing the new Simrit single, Some May Say, in its entirety in just a moment. And afterwards, please do head over to wherever you get your music, Spotify, Apple Music, and download the new Simrit single. SIMRIT is how it's spelled. Some May Say is the new single. And while you're at it, definitely download the new album, Live in Los Angeles, that came out earlier this year. This incredible, extraordinary music. Thank you, Simrit, for allowing us to play it. And without further ado.
1, 2.
Heard what they may say all my life. Some will they may say all their lives. All my Some will they may say some will they may say some will they may say all my life. Some will they may say
Thank you.